This is a little review of the strategy that we use when we have 4 terms, and that's grouping. And this was from chapter 6, section 1, by the way. So let's look at about 4 problems here. Here's the first one. PQ plus 5Q plus 2P plus 10. All right, so just like any problem, the first thing we would check for is a common factor, and on this problem there's not one. And we know to do grouping because it's got 4 terms. So we group the first 2, and we group the last 2. Okay. Now, then we just forget about the last 2. We just act like they're not even there. Okay. We just look at the first 2. And we say, what can I factor out of those? Well, in this case, they both have a common factor of Q.
Is it 1 or is it okay?
Okay. Yes, there's a 1 here. And out of 1 and 5, I could factor out a 1, but that doesn't really help me. And then both of them have a factor of Q.
So it's Q, it's not 1.
It's 1Q,
Okay.
which is the same thing as just Q.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm getting,
Yeah. Okay. So if I factor Q out of PQ, that's going to leave me with P. Or another way to ask yourself that question is, what would I multiply by Q that would give me PQ? Well, I'd multiply by P to get PQ. And if I factor Q out of 5Q, it's going to leave me with 5. Okay, so I'm done with the first set of parentheses. Now I'll go to the second. Now I'm not worried at all what's in the first 2. They're done. I'm just looking at the second 2. 2P and 10. I'm asking what can I factor out of that? We can take a 2 out. Okay. 2 factored out of 2P leaves P. 2 factored out of 10 leaves 5. Now, in class on the lesson for 6.1, I explained why you can do what we're getting ready to do. So if you missed that explanation, you can come see me sometime and I'll talk through it again. But here's what we can do without explaining to you why at this point. If these 2 parentheses match up, if they're the same, whatever's inside of them becomes one factor in my answer, P plus 5. The other factor in my answer comes from what's outside the parentheses, which I have a Q over here and a plus 2 here. So what we're trying to do is get those 2 parentheses to match up so that we can make this last move and end up with P plus 5 times Q plus 2.
So basically, whatever you factor out,
That is exactly right. Good thinking. Now, one other little thing I want to look at with you is if you have, actually 2 other things I want to look at with you. Let's say we had this problem, 2xy plus 3y plus 2x plus 3. On this problem, there's no common factor in all 4 terms. Okay, we know to do grouping because there's 4 terms. So group the first 2, group the last 2. The only common factor between 2 and 3 is 1, but I see that both of these terms have a factor of y, so I can take a y out, which is going to leave me 2x plus 3. Bring the plus down. Okay, now let's look at this 2x plus 3, and this is the reason I wanted to show you this problem. You might say to yourself, well, the only common factor between 2 and 3 is 1, and you would be right. So if 1's the only thing you can take out, then take the 1 out. That's fine. Let's take a 1 out here. The reason that's a good move is because that's going to leave me a 2x and a 3 inside the parentheses, which is going to allow my two parentheses to be the same again. So the moral of this story is sometimes the only thing you can factor out is 1, and if that's the case, then factor it out and see if your two parentheses match up. And that can get you to your answer. Okay, one last thing to show you about grouping. It's similar to what we looked at a few moments ago. This problem has x cubed plus 3x squared minus 5x minus 15. So it's got 4 terms, there's no common factor. We'll group the first two. Now, when you group these last two, this first minus only applies to the 5, so it's got to go with the 5. We got to put it in the parentheses with the 5. And so to show that we're not really multiplying those two things, we usually just slip a little plus sign in between there. Okay, so looking at the first two, out of x cubed and 3x squared, we can take an x squared out, which is going to leave us x plus 3. Okay, now that brings us to the last two. Okay, now here's the deal. A lot of people, when they look at negative 5x minus 15, they think, well, the common factor would be 5. But let's look at what would happen if I factored a 5 out. If I factor a 5 out of negative 5x, it's going to leave me negative x. If I factor a 5 out of negative 15, it's going to leave me minus 3. And it's not the same. That's right. I needed to match this first parenthesis. Now, to get it the same, I would need both of these signs in here to flip. To flip both of these signs, what we're going to do is flip the sign on what we factored out. Instead of factoring out a positive 5, we'll factor out a negative 5. Let's see what that does for us. Okay, so if I factor a negative 5 out of negative 5x, it's going to leave x. If I factor a negative 5 out of negative 15, it's going to leave plus 3, and now my parentheses do match up. So if you need your signs to switch the sign on what you're factoring out. Here our answer would be x plus 3 as one factor and x squared minus 5 as the other.